Hey guys, tonight we are climbing into a time machine set to the 1950s, and we're not going to Disneyland. We're going to the living room of the average American man, the guy in the short-sleeved button-down, standing in the driveway with a garden hose and the expression of someone who has just realised the lawn is never, ever going to be finished. Tonight, we're exploring the impossible, contradictory, deeply exhausting standard that every man in post-war America was quietly expected to meet, and almost none of them actually did, even though none of them admitted it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and you clearly understand that history's most interesting stories are sometimes just regular people being quietly suffocated by expectation. Your suggestion means a lot, and honestly, this channel wouldn't be what it is without people like you shaping it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating. And if you haven't found us on Spotify yet, there's a link in the description, perfect for falling asleep to on a long commute or a longer weekend. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft white noise, pull your blanket up, and get genuinely comfortable. You've earned it. Let's pause here for just a moment, because there are some things worth wondering about. Have you ever considered what it actually meant to be a man in 1952? Did he enjoy any of it? Or did he just stand very still and hope no one noticed? Was he happy in that house with that car and that lawn? Or was he terrified and pretending not to be? Did he know how to talk about his feelings? Or did he simply reroute all of them into mowing patterns? Could he cry? Was he allowed to? What happened if he wanted to quit the job, skip the barbecue and read a book in a dark room? And what exactly did it cost a man to look that confident when his entire life had been handed to him as a checklist? Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1952 America. You're 28 years old, you have a mortgage, a wife, a child who appears to be teething, a car that needs an oil change, a boss who plays golf, and a vague, low-grade terror that you're doing all of this wrong. Nobody told you how. Nobody was going to. Before he said a single word or earned a single dollar, the 1950s American man had already been evaluated. Appearance was the first test, and it was non-negotiable. You were expected to be clean-shaven every single morning, not occasionally, not when you felt like it, but every day with the grim precision of a military inspection. Your hair was to be short, combed, and in no way expressive of anything. A suit or pressed trousers were standard for work, a clean shirt was minimum for everything else, and shoes were to be polished to the kind of shine that suggested you had nothing better to do. Which of course you did, but that was not the point. The point was that a man who looked put together was a man who had his life together, and any visual evidence to the contrary was a social catastrophe that could follow you to the next neighbourhood cookout. So let's walk through the morning routine. You wake up, you shave, not with anything forgiving, with a double-edged safety razor and shaving cream you worked into a lather with a brush, like a man performing a ritual which you were. One nick on the chin, and you spent the next 20 minutes with a small piece of tissue stuck to your face, which undermined the whole enterprise. Then the hair. Brill cream, Vitalis, or something similar. A small amount worked through with a comb until every strand knew its place and stayed there. The part was straight. This was not optional. A crooked part was a crooked man, or at least that was the energy. The clothes came next. Your trousers were pressed, ideally the night before or by your wife that morning. The iron and the ironing board were her domain, which meant you had already outsourced a significant portion of your own presentation to another person, without either of you formally acknowledging this arrangement. The shirt was white, or pale blue. The tie was knotted correctly, which meant the dimple sat just below the knot and the tip reached your belt buckle exactly. Too short, you looked careless. Too long, you looked like you'd tried and failed, which was somehow worse. The jacket went on last, and you checked yourself in the mirror with the focused expression of a man who is not checking himself in the mirror. Here is the modern translation. Imagine being required to look like a LinkedIn profile photo every single day before 8 in the morning, Regardless of how you slept, how you feel, or whether it's a Tuesday in January with nothing interesting happening to anyone, that is approximately the energy. The 1950s grooming standard was not vanity. It was compliance. Looking sharp was proof that you were in control of at least the visible surface of your life, and the visible surface was what everyone saw, so the visible surface was what mattered. There was also the matter of weight. Nobody said it directly, that would have been impolite, but the cultural pressure to maintain a lean, capable-looking physique was real and ambient. Advertisements, magazines, and the simple act of comparing yourself to every man you saw at the office conveyed the message efficiently. You were supposed to look like someone who could carry luggage across a parking lot without breathing hard. Whether you actually could was between you and the parking lot. And at the end of the day, you came home, loosened the tie, and the performance paused briefly. But tomorrow morning, the razor was waiting. The comb was waiting. The mirror was waiting. And so was the version of yourself that the world had decided, without consulting you, was the acceptable one. In the 1950s, a man's worth was calculated in the most literal way possible, by his paycheck. Not his kindness, not his humour, not his ability to comfort a crying child at 2 a.m, his income. He was expected to support an entire household on a single salary, to pay the mortgage, cover the grocery bill, handle the car insurance, and still have enough left over to look like he wasn't struggling. Because struggling, even a little, was something you kept to yourself. The idea of a man admitting financial stress to friends or neighbours was so far outside the cultural script that it might as well have been a foreign language. You simply earned more, spent less, and smiled at every barbecue as though the bank statement in your kitchen drawer was none of their business. The post-war economy made this expectation feel achievable in a way it hadn't been for the previous generation, which had lived through the Depression and understood, in their bones, what real financial collapse looked like. The 1950s was supposed to be different. The factories were running, the jobs were available, and the GI Bill had handed veterans the tools, the education benefits, the home loans, to build a life that their fathers could not have imagined. The message was clear. This was the moment. This was when it all came together. A man with a job, a house, and a family was not just doing fine, he was winning. But the arithmetic was often more complicated than the mythology. The mortgage payment was fixed. The grocery bill was not. The children needed shoes, and shoes cost money, and then they needed different shoes 3 months later because their feet were apparently doing something experimental. The car needed new tyres. The furnace made a sound in November that suggested it was reconsidering its life choices. None of these events were dramatic individually. Collectively, they constituted a low-grade financial pressure that many men carried in complete silence, because admitting to it would have felt like announcing a personal failure in a time when failure had no approved place. And here is the part that no one talked about at dinner. Your salary was not just money. It was the metric by which your peers, your neighbours, your father-in-law, and in some quiet internal way yourself, measured whether you were succeeding at being a man. A raise was not just a raise, it was confirmation. A stagnant salary was not just inconvenient, it was an accusation. The man who couldn't grow his income was a man who had, by the prevailing logic, stopped growing entirely. Think of it this way. Imagine if your entire sense of personal value was tied to one number that a company decided for you once a year after a conversation you weren't fully in control of in an economy you couldn't manage, based on performance criteria that shifted depending on who was doing the evaluating, and you could not discuss how that made you feel. Not with your wife, not with your friends, not with anyone. You just absorbed it and came home and sat at the dinner table and passed the bread. The breadwinner identity was a cage that many men walked into voluntarily, because the alternative, not being the provider, not being the one who held it together, was a void the culture had not filled with anything else. So you earned, and you carried it, and you did not put it down. The 1950s. American man did not work from home. He did not have flexible hours, a standing desk, or the option to log on in his pajamas. He left the house every morning at roughly the same time, dressed as though he were being reviewed, and made his way, by car, by train, by bus, by sheer willpower, to a job that was unlikely to be his dream job, in an office that was unlikely to be particularly comfortable, for a boss who was unlikely to remember his first name correctly. The commute was just something that happened to you, like weather. You accepted it. Some men commuted an hour each way in near silence, reading a folded newspaper, standing in a packed train car, arriving at their desks already slightly depleted. This was called being a responsible adult. The train was its own world, a narrow car packed with men in nearly identical coats, holding newspapers open at the same angles, studiously avoiding eye contact with the same practiced indifference. Nobody talked about anything real on the commuter train. The weather, maybe. Sports scores sometimes. A brief exchange about nothing that was really an exchange about everything, about the shared understanding that you were all headed to the same approximate fate and had tacitly agreed not to discuss it. The newspaper was armour. If you were reading, you didn't have to talk. Reading was one of the few socially acceptable ways to be alone in a crowd in the 1950s, and commuting men used it with quiet gratitude. If you drove, you had the radio, which in the 1950s offered a choice between news delivered by men who sounded certain about things and music that was either big band arrangements or the early tremors of something that would later horrify you. You sat in traffic that was already beginning to calcify into the permanent condition it would become over the following decades. You found a parking spot, which was its own small negotiation with the universe. You locked the car, straightened your jacket, and walked into the building. The commute existed in a strange temporal category, not work, but not rest, not home, but not away. It was transit time, unaccounted for in the official ledger of the day, an hour or more each way that was neither here nor there, and could not be spent on anything particularly useful. A man who commuted 5 days a week was spending roughly 10 hours a week doing nothing, which the era had not developed a framework for acknowledging as a significant portion of a life. Modern you, reading or listening to this from your couch or your bed or your home office, you have invented entire productivity philosophies around the commute, podcasts, audiobooks, language learning, mindfulness apps. The 1950s man had a damp newspaper and his own thoughts, neither of which he was especially eager to engage with at 7:45 in the morning. And then the day was over, and you reversed it. Back to the train or back to the car, back through traffic, back to the house. You walked in the door and the family was already in motion. Dinner, children, noise, the particular domestic energy of a household that had been operating without you all day and didn't fully pause to accommodate your arrival. You hung up your coat. You sat down. Tomorrow you would do it again because that was the arrangement, and you had agreed to it, and the agreement once made was not something you revisited out loud. The post-war American office was a masterpiece of organized misery. Rows of identical desks, identical men in nearly identical suits, fluorescent lights humming overhead with the energy of something that was technically alive but clearly not thriving. There was a boss, and the boss had a private office with a door, which was the entire visible difference between success and failure in 1953. You did not question the boss. You did not disagree with the boss in front of other people. You nodded, you produced your work, you attended the meetings, and you contributed to the meetings just enough to be noticed, but not so much that you seemed difficult. Office politics were not called office politics. They were called the way things work, and you figured them out alone, through a combination of observation and quiet suffering. The physical environment of the 1950s office was not designed with human comfort in mind. It was designed for surveillance and efficiency, which are related goals. Open floor plans meant your output was visible at all times. Your arrival time was noted. Your departure time was noted. The length of time you spent in the men's room was not officially noted, but if it was excessive, someone would say something eventually, indirectly. The way things were said in 1950s workplaces, Not directly, but through a comment that contained a comment. You learned to pass the layers. The work itself varied. Insurance, sales, manufacturing management, banking, any number of industries that had expanded dramatically after the war. But the culture of the work was largely uniform. You did your job. You did it reliably. You did not make scenes. Innovation was acceptable if it aligned with what the organisation already believed it wanted. Radical suggestions were filed under interesting idea and never mentioned again. You were not hired to reimagine the company. You were hired to show up on time and produce a predictable output with a pleasant demeanour, and the men who understood this earliest tended to advance most efficiently. Lunch was either eaten at a counter with other men from the office, or brought from home in a bag your wife had packed, which contained a sandwich, an apple, and a cookie, and which you ate at your desk in 12 minutes because taking a proper lunch break suggested you were not serious. The coffee was bad. Not bad in the way that bad coffee is bad today, where you have a reference point of good coffee, and the gap is measurable. Bad in the way of something that had been made at 7 in the morning and was still being consumed at 3 in the afternoon by men who had stopped tasting it. Here is what the 1950s office had in common with your current workplace. The hierarchy was real, the politics were invisible until they weren't, and the relationship between effort and reward was mediated by a layer of human judgment that was not entirely rational. Here is what was different. Nobody was going to ask how you were doing and mean it. Mental health was not a workplace conversation. Burnout had not been named yet. If you were exhausted and demoralized, the prescription was to work harder and smile more, which addressed neither thing and was offered in complete sincerity. You left the office at 5 o'clock, assuming you were not the kind of man who stayed late to be seen staying late, which many men were. You rode the elevator down. You walked out into whatever the weather was doing and became briefly nobody's employee. It lasted until the commute ended, and you were someone else's husband and father, and those were also full-time positions, and the shift change between them was neither acknowledged nor given any transition time at all. In the 1950s, a man's handshake was not just a greeting, it was a character assessment delivered in under 2 seconds. Too limp, and you were weak, untrustworthy, possibly European. Too aggressive, and you were compensating. The correct handshake was firm, brief, dry, and accompanied by direct eye contact and a confident nod. It sounds simple until you realise that every introduction carried the weight of a first impression that men around you would remember and discuss later, at length, in your absence. Boys were taught to shake hands correctly by their fathers, who had been taught by their fathers all the way back through an unbroken chain of anxious men trying to appear more solid than they felt. The handshake governed entry into the social world of men in this era in a way that is difficult to fully convey if you have grown up in a time of fist bumps and brief nods. It was the opening transaction of every professional relationship, every new neighbour introduction, every first meeting with a potential business partner, client, or your girlfriend's father, who was already forming an opinion about you before you finished the sentence that started with hello. Your hand was a credential. It was presented and evaluated the way a resume might be today, except that the evaluation was instantaneous, and the result was never shared with you directly. The physics of it mattered enormously. You extended your hand at the right moment, not too early, which was eager, not too late, which was uncertain. You met the other hand at the web of the thumb, which was the correct anatomical contact point. You applied pressure that was confident without being dominant, which required reading the other person in real time and calibrating accordingly, which meant that every handshake was actually a small social negotiation disguised as a reflex. You maintained eye contact throughout. You released cleanly. You said the man's name if you knew it. There was also the matter of the hands themselves. Cold hands were a liability. They suggested nervousness or poor circulation, neither of which inspired confidence. Sweating hands were a disaster. Men who were prone to nervous sweating in the palms developed private strategies. The discreet wipe on the trouser leg just before the introduction, executed so smoothly it was nearly invisible. The worry about whether it was visible was itself a source of the sweating, which is the kind of recursive trap that the 1950s social landscape was particularly good at constructing. Boys practiced. Not formally, not with scheduled handshake rehearsals, but through the accumulation of corrections. Your father would take your hand and demonstrate the grip. He would tell you to look him in the eye. He would shake his head slightly if you got it wrong. The lesson was delivered without explanation of why it mattered so much, because the why was assumed to be obvious. A man who couldn't shake hands correctly was a man who couldn't be trusted with anything more complicated, and the logic of that, if you examined it, made no sense whatsoever. But it was the operating logic of the era, and it ran very deep. Today, you might offer a wave, a nod, a hug if you've met the person before, a handshake or an elbow bump depending on what year it is and what is happening with the world's respiratory systems. The range of acceptable greetings has expanded enormously. In the 1950s, there was essentially one, and if you executed it incorrectly in front of the right person at the wrong moment, the social recovery could take years, or might not come at all. Owning a home in the 1950s was not just a financial decision, it was a declaration of character. The suburbs were new, gleaming, and deeply serious. Rows of nearly identical houses on nearly identical lots, each one representing a man who had, in some fundamental way, arrived. You had the house, you had the lawn, you had the driveway, the garage, the gutters that needed cleaning every October without fail. The house was proof that you had done what was required of you. It was also, somewhat exhaustingly, a maintenance project that never ended. Something was always leaking. Something was always peeling. Something was always in need of a repair you'd been putting off since February, telling yourself and your wife that you'd get to it this weekend, which both of you eventually stopped believing. The post-war suburbs were built fast, which is a polite way of saying they were built with the materials and workmanship that come with speed and economy. Levittown and its counterparts across America produced thousands of homes in remarkably short periods, and while those homes were genuinely transformative for the families who moved into them, real bedrooms, real kitchens, real yards, they were also, structurally, works in progress. The windows did not always seal properly. The pipes had opinions about cold weather. The basement, if there was one, had ideas about moisture that were at odds with the concept of a dry basement. All of this became your problem the moment you signed the mortgage paperwork and the previous owner's car disappeared around the corner. The house was also a stage. The front of it, what faced the street, what your neighbours and anyone driving past could see, was maintained to a standard that the back of it often was not. The front door was painted, the shutters were straight, the flower bed was tended, and the driveway was free of oil stains, ideally. The backyard was more forgiving. It was where the children's toys accumulated and where the garden that your wife had started with enthusiasm in April was allowed to become complicated by June. But the front was a public statement, and public statements were held to a higher standard than private reality. This is true of many things in the 1950s, and the house was simply the largest and most expensive version of the same principle. Neighbours noticed everything. This is important to understand. The suburb was a small, dense social ecosystem in which everyone was watching everyone else, with the focused attention of people who had very little else happening on a Tuesday evening. If your gutters sagged, your neighbours saw the sagging gutters. If your paint was peeling, the neighbourhood saw the peeling paint. These observations were rarely communicated directly. That would have been rude, which was its own kind of social catastrophe. But they accumulated into a general impression that circulated through the neighbourhood with the efficiency of a well-maintained rumour. And so you maintained the house. You painted it. You fixed the gutters in October. You replaced the section of fence that the wind had damaged in March. You did all of this not because you were particularly excited about fence repair, but because the house was your face in the world of the neighbourhood, and your face needed to be presentable. The house was you, expressed in wood and shingles and a front door that had been repainted twice in 4 years, because you could not quite agree with yourself on the right shade of green. Nothing in the 1950s better captured the particular madness of masculine expectation than the front lawn. It was not enough to have grass. You needed the right grass, cut to the correct height, trimmed at the edges, and free of the kind of visible weeds that suggested moral failure. Saturday morning lawn care was practically a religious observance in post-war suburbs, a ritual of loud machines and quiet competition. You clocked your neighbour's lawn from the driveway. He clocked yours. Nobody said anything. Everything was said. A man whose lawn was yellowing in July was a man whose life, by implication, was not fully under control. And in the 1950s, losing control of anything, especially something visible from the street, was among the more unspeakable things that could happen to you. The lawnmower itself was a piece of equipment that men took seriously in a way that was difficult to fully explain to anyone who had not grown up in a suburb during this era. You pushed it, in the early part of the decade, in the relentless straight lines of a man who had decided that geometry was a personal value. The riding mower arrived as the decade progressed and was received with the quiet enthusiasm of a genuine technological advance. Suddenly you were sitting down while mowing, which felt almost decadent, and the time savings meant you could now apply the saved hours to edging, which had its own set of standards. Edging was the detail work of lawn maintenance, the part that separated the men who were merely keeping up from the men who were genuinely committed. The line between the grass and the driveway was supposed to be clean and vertical, cut with an edging tool that you walked along the boundary with the patience of someone laying cable. Too shallow, and the grass crept onto the concrete and you looked neglectful. Too aggressive, and you carved a trench that looked like something had been excavating your property. The correct edge was a clean straight line that said, "I have thought about this border between the grass and the pavement, and I have handled it with intention, which is how I handle everything." Dandelions were the enemy. Not dandelions as a plant, as a symbol. A dandelion in your front lawn was evidence that something had gotten past you, that the defence had failed, that a small yellow invader had established itself in full view of the street. You could address this with chemical spray, which the post-war era made newly available in forms that were effective and almost completely unexamined in terms of what else they were doing to the surrounding ecosystem. You applied the spray with the focused seriousness of someone addressing a specific threat to a specific thing they cared about, which was accurate. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The lawn was a patch of grass. It grew whether you wanted it to or not. It required water, which in most of the country fell from the sky at irregular intervals and in quantities you could not control. It could brown in a drought, flood in a wet season, and be eaten by grubs regardless of what you did about any of it. And yet the expectation was that you would maintain it in a state of permanent manicured readiness, as though nature had agreed to cooperate with the aesthetic standards of the post-war suburb and simply needed to be reminded of the arrangement each Saturday morning. The lawn was a small outdoor performance staged for an audience that was technically your neighbours, but was, in a deeper sense, the version of yourself that 1950s America required you to be: green, orderly, managed, and visibly in control. Mow it again next week. The grass is already growing. In 1950s America, a man and his car were not two separate things. The car was the man, expressed in chrome and horsepower. You chose it carefully, maintained it obsessively, and spoke about it in a specific reverent register that was mostly unavailable to other topics in your life. The car said something about who you were and where you were going, and while those things were sometimes contradictory, you were going to the grocery store, but the car suggested somewhere more glamorous. The fantasy was part of the point. Men washed their cars on Sunday afternoons with the focused serenity of someone meditating. The car was the one place in the 1950s domestic landscape where a man could express himself without being asked to explain. The cars of the 1950s were not modest objects. They were enormous, chrome-laden, tail-finned machines that had been designed by people who had looked at aircraft and thought, What if we did that, but on a road, and for a family of 4 from Ohio? The tail fins appeared around the middle of the decade and grew, annually, in ways that no engineering necessity could fully account for. They were pure expression, a cultural declaration that America was large, prosperous, and aerodynamically aspirational, even when parked in a suburban driveway going nowhere at all. Colour mattered. The two-tone paint jobs that became fashionable in the mid-50s, white over turquoise, cream over red, were not chosen arbitrarily. You thought about the colour of your car the way you thought about the colour of your front door, which is to say with more care than you would have admitted if someone had asked you directly. The car was visible in the neighbourhood every day. It sat in the driveway and communicated something to every person who drove past. You wanted that communication to reflect well on you, which meant the car needed to be clean, reasonably new, and at least aspirationally consistent with the income level you were presenting to the world. The engine was the private domain. Under the hood was a conversation men had with each other in a language that was technically about mechanical function, but was really about identity and capability. You knew how your engine worked. If you did not, you were in the process of learning, because a man who could not speak knowledgeably about his own engine in the 1950s was a man who had ceded an important conversational territory. Horsepower numbers were cited with the same casual authority with which you might recite sports statistics. Displacement was a relevant fact about a person. Sunday afternoon, you wash the car. This was not a chore in the way that other chores were chores. It was closer to a ritual, a private negotiation between a man and one of the few things in his life that was entirely his, not the company's, not the bank's, not the family's in the way the house was. The car had your name on the registration. You buffed it to a shine that the afternoon light hit at an angle that felt, for a moment, genuinely satisfying. And satisfaction was not a feeling you had access to in most areas of your 1950s life without significant complication. The car gave it to you clean and uncomplicated. This is why men loved their cars the way they did, and why, in a culture that gave men very few socially approved outlets for any kind of passion, the automobile became the one they poured everything into. There is a version of the 1950s American man that looks, from the outside, like contentment. He is sitting at the head of the dinner table. There is food, there is a family, there is a roof overhead. What the image does not show is what it cost him to sit there, because the provider myth of the post-war era came with fine print that was never disclosed at the start. A man was supposed to meet every need, financial, physical, practical, of every person in his household, without complaint, without acknowledging limits, and without asking for anything in return. Asking for help was not in the vocabulary. Admitting exhaustion was not in the vocabulary. The vocabulary was, "I've got it, I'll handle it, don't worry about it." He said this until he believed it, or until he didn't, and then he said it anyway. The head of the table was a symbolic position that came with real weight. You sat at one end, your wife at the other, the children distributed between you along both sides, and the physical arrangement of the family communicated something about authority, responsibility, and the direction in which things were supposed to flow. Food came to the table. Money paid for the food. You provided the money. The logic was circular and complete, and it left very little room for anyone to ask what it felt like from the inside, which was fine, because no one was going to ask. The provider role did not come with a job description that anyone wrote down, but it had implicit requirements that were widely understood. You covered the mortgage, and you covered it on time, because a man who missed a mortgage payment was a man whose family's security was in question, and the family's security was your specific personal responsibility. You covered the utilities, the groceries, the school clothes, the paediatrician visits, the piano lessons if the children had piano lessons, the summer vacation if there was a summer vacation, and the Christmas presents, which arrived under a tree each December, as though they had been arranged by magic rather than by a man who had done careful accounting in the kitchen in November. The magic was the performance. The accounting was the reality. You also fed everyone else first, in ways both literal and figurative. The food on the table was distributed in a hierarchy that placed your needs last, not because anyone formally decided this, but because the logic of the provider role made your own comfort secondary to the household's function. A hungry man at the head of the table was a fine thing. A hungry child, a hungry wife, a household that was not adequately fed, that was a failing, and the failing was yours. Think of it this way. Imagine being responsible for the weather, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a practical, daily, everyone is watching sense. Good weather is expected and unremarked upon. Bad weather is a personal failure that reflects something fundamental about your character. Now do that every day for 30 years while also maintaining the lawn. That is approximately the emotional arithmetic of the 1950s provider role, and the men who lived inside it rarely, if ever, sat at the head of that table and said, "This is a lot." They passed the bread and waited for the next thing to need handling. The 1950s American man was expected not only to be a certain kind of man, but to have a certain kind of wife, and the two expectations were so thoroughly entangled that it was nearly impossible to have one without the other. The wife was meant to be pleasant, capable, attractive, a good cook, a good mother, and supportive of everything he did in a way that never veered into unsolicited opinion. She ran the household, managed the children, maintained the social calendar, and appeared effortlessly put together in a way that reflected well on him. This was, of course, a complete fantasy assembled by advertisers, magazine editors, and a post-war culture desperate to believe it had figured something out. But as a fantasy, it had enormous structural weight, and the men who couldn't live up to it often felt as though the failure was somehow theirs. Because here is the thing about the idealized wife of the 1950s. She was not just a companion. She was a performance metric. A man was evaluated partly through her. If she was well dressed at the neighborhood gathering, that reflected something about him. If the house she managed was orderly and the children were clean, and the dinner she produced was good, those were, in the ambient logic of the era, marks in his column as much as hers. He had chosen well. He had provided the conditions for her success. Her visible contentment was a product of his adequacy, and her visible struggle, if it appeared, if it leaked through, was a question mark about his. This put the 1950s marriage in a strange position. Two people were locked in a mutual performance, each responsible for the other's social legibility, and the performance was more important than the conversation about whether either of them actually wanted to be doing it. The man who came home to a house that was not running smoothly was not a man who offered assistance. He was a man who had, in some interpretive framework, been failed by the arrangement. The response to this was not generally productive. The women who lived inside this arrangement had their own complex experience of it, which is a story for another night, but the effect on the men is worth pausing on. The idealized wife of the 1950s was also a mirror, and what she reflected was how well you were doing as a provider, as a husband, as a man. That made her, regardless of her actual feelings, a constant assessment. Men who were perceptive enough to understand that their wives were real people, with real needs and genuine dissatisfactions, often had no framework for what to do with that understanding. The culture had given them a role but no tools for the relationship underneath it. What did it cost a man to need his wife to perform contentment in order to confirm that he was performing adequacy? It cost something he could not name, in a currency the era did not acknowledge. And so the 1950s marriage was often two people who cared about each other, or had once, sitting across a dinner table and maintaining an arrangement whose terms they had never fully discussed, because fully discussing it would have required a vocabulary that neither of them had been given, by parents who had also not had it, in a culture that was actively uninterested in developing one. The wife he was supposed to have was happy, capable, and quietly grateful. Whether the wife he actually had was any of those things was between them, and mostly that is exactly where it stayed. Fatherhood in the 1950s occupied a strange middle position, enormously important in principle, oddly hands-off in practice. A man was supposed to be a good father, to provide for his children, to set an example of strength and stability, to be there. But there was a conspicuous absence of instruction about what being there actually looked like on a Tuesday night. Emotional availability was not a phrase in the 1950s parenting vocabulary. You showed up, you provided, you attended the school play, and you perhaps tossed a ball in the backyard on weekends, and this was considered, by most cultural measures, a complete and adequate performance of fatherhood. The children who grew up during this era would spend a significant portion of their adult lives unpacking what exactly their fathers had been feeling the whole time. The model you had inherited was not generous. Your own father had likely been raised in the Depression, possibly served in a war, and arrived at fatherhood with the emotional repertoire of a man who'd been through things that were not discussed and had developed self-sufficiency as a survival strategy rather than a personality choice. He had provided. He had stayed. That was the template, and you carried it forward because it was the only template available, and because examining it required a kind of reflective apparatus that the culture had actively discouraged you from developing. Discipline was one of the father's primary assigned functions, which meant that your involvement in the children's daily lives was often most visible at its most uncomfortable. You were the consequence. Your wife managed the household all day, navigated the children through meals and homework and small disasters, and reserved the larger infractions for when you came home, which meant that your arrival was sometimes preceded by the sentence the children dreaded most. Wait until your father gets home. You walked in from a full day of work, having had no transition, no briefing, no context for whatever had occurred in your absence, and were expected to produce a measured, authoritative response to a situation you had not witnessed and could not fully understand. This was called fatherhood, and it was not working especially well for anyone involved, but no one was evaluating it. The weekends offered something closer to genuine connection, and many fathers took it seriously in their own way. The backyard catch, the fishing trip, the drive that went nowhere in particular, these were the spaces where something real could happen between a father and his children, where the role relaxed slightly, and the person inside it became briefly visible. Boys noticed. They catalogued those moments with the careful attention of children who understood, without being able to articulate it, that they were seeing something they would not see often. Daughters had a different experience. The 1950s, father was not culturally equipped to be close to his daughters in ways that went beyond affection and protection. He provided for them, he worried about them, he frightened their potential suitors, and he expected them to eventually be taken care of by someone who would do for them what he had done, which was to say he expected them to marry well and disappear into the same arrangement his wife was in, because that was, as far as the available script indicated, what happened next. The idea of a father and daughter having a genuine conversation about her inner life, her ambitions, her actual experience of the world was not impossible, but it was rare enough to be remembered as exceptional. Here is what the 1950s father left behind, in addition to the house and the car and the savings account, a silence that his children spent decades trying to interpret. What was he thinking at the dinner table? What did he actually feel about his life? Did he ever doubt any of it? The answers, in most cases, went with him. He had been a good provider. He had been present in the physical sense, and the rest of him, the interior person who had lived behind the role, remained, as it had always been, carefully and completely out of reach. The 1950s American man did not talk about how he felt. This was not a personal choice so much as a cultural decree, delivered so thoroughly and from so many directions that most men did not realize it was a decree at all. It simply was the way things were. You did not discuss anxiety, loneliness, grief, confusion, or fear. You did not describe the low-grade dread of Sunday evenings before a Monday you dreaded. You did not admit that you sometimes weren't sure you were doing any of this correctly. You projected stability, and if something was genuinely wrong, if the job was bad, if the marriage was hard, if the weight of expectation was pressing down in ways you could not name, you found a quiet place for it and left it there. The emotional vault was not constructed all at once. It was built incrementally, beginning in boyhood, one small correction at a time. You cried, and someone told you that boys didn't cry. You were afraid, and someone told you there was nothing to be afraid of, which was not the same as comfort, but was the available response. You expressed uncertainty, and the expression was met with a firmness that communicated, "This is not the kind of thing we say out loud." By the time you were an adult man in the 1950s, the vault was complete and largely automatic. You did not decide not to talk about your feelings. You simply did not talk about them. The way you did not think about breathing, it had become that integrated, that invisible. There was a word for men who talked about their feelings in this era, and the word was not complimentary. Soft was a common one, weak was another. The vocabulary of masculine failure in the 1950s was almost entirely composed of adjectives that described insufficient containment, of emotion, of need, of any visible evidence that the interior life existed and was complicated. A man who kept it together was a man who had his priorities straight. A man who let something through was a man who had lost the thread. And losing the thread was not an option when you had a mortgage and a family and a lawn that was already planning its next act of mild rebellion. The practical consequences of this were significant and largely invisible until they weren't. Stress accumulated without outlet. Grief had nowhere to go, and so it went nowhere, which is to say it stayed. Men who had come back from wars that they did not discuss carried experiences that had no language in the domestic landscape of a post-war suburb, and those experiences expressed themselves sideways, in drinking, in silence, in a distance that the family read as coldness, and the man experienced as the only available option. Think about what you do when you have a hard day. You might call someone. You might describe the feeling to a person who is capable of receiving it and saying something useful back. You might write it down, talk it through, sit with it consciously, and let it resolve. Now remove all of those options and tell yourself that using any of them would constitute a failure of character. What is left is a man sitting in a chair in a living room in 1956 watching television and not being available in a way that his family will spend years trying to understand. The vault was full by the end of most men's lives, and in many cases it was never opened, not because there was nothing in it, but because by the time anyone knew to ask, the man inside had forgotten or decided that the contents were no longer accessible. He had been so good at not feeling things out loud that he had eventually become uncertain whether he felt them at all. In theory, the 1950s weekend was a reward. 2 days of rest after 5 days of labour, time to relax with the family and recharge for the week ahead. In practice, the weekend was a second job with a different dress code. Saturday meant maintenance, the lawn, the car, the dripping faucet, the loose step on the back porch. Sunday meant church if the family attended, a big meal, possibly a drive, and the preparation of the particular kind of quiet dread that arrives on Sunday evenings and announces itself with a specific heaviness in the chest. A man who admitted he was tired on a Saturday morning was a man who had perhaps not thought through the implications. Relaxation was permitted, but only after everything else was done, and everything else was never done. Saturday morning had a texture that was unlike any other part of the week. You woke without an alarm, which was a small freedom, and lay in bed for approximately 4 minutes before the list assembled itself in your mind with the cheerful inevitability of something that had been waiting all week. The gutters, the oil change, the section of fence, the storm windows that needed to come down and be replaced with the screen windows, or vice versa depending on the season, which you had been putting off for 2 weekends now, and which your wife had mentioned once, carefully, in a way that conveyed that she would not mention it again because she did not need to. You got up. The hardware store was a Saturday morning institution in the 1950s suburb, and it was full of men who all had the same expression. Purposeful, slightly resigned, holding a list. The hardware store was one of the few public spaces in the 1950s where men could admit implicitly that something in their house was broken, because the admission took the form of purchasing the thing needed to fix it, which was its own kind of competence. You bought the correct size bolt, the right grade of sandpaper, the specific variety of cork, and the purchase itself was a performance of capability, even if you were only approximately sure what you were going to do with it once you got home. Sunday was supposed to be rest and was, in a narrow technical sense, somewhat less physical than Saturday. Church in the morning for many families, a large midday meal that your wife had been constructing since before you finished your second cup of coffee, and then the afternoon, which existed in a kind of temporal suspension. Men napped, sometimes, in the armchair after the midday meal, briefly and without apology, and these naps were among the most honest things that happened in the 1950s domestic landscape. The body simply overrode the performance for 20 minutes and took what it needed. But Sunday afternoon carried its own specific atmosphere. As the light changed in the late afternoon and the temperature dropped slightly in autumn, or the shadows lengthened in summer, something arrived that was not quite sadness, and not quite dread, but occupied the same general neighbourhood. Tomorrow was Monday. The commute, the office, the boss, the fluorescent lights, the performance of competent stability, all of it was 12 hours away and closing. You pushed it down, you turned on the television, you watched something, and by 9 o'clock you were in bed, setting the alarm, preparing to become once again the man the week required you to be. The weekend had happened. You could not entirely say that you had rested, but it had happened, and in approximately 5 days you would have another one, and it would go roughly the same way. And this was called a life, and you were grateful for it, or you told yourself you were, which in the 1950s amounted to approximately the same thing. The post-war American man was expected to fix things, not some things, not the easy things as a category. Plumbing, electrical work, carpentry, painting, roofing, appliance repair, automotive maintenance, all of it fell under the general heading of what a man was supposed to be capable of, regardless of whether he had received any training in any of it. Hardware stores in the 1950s did not sell the fantasy that these tasks were simple. They sold the tools, which implied you already knew what to do with them. And so men across suburban America quietly fumbled through repairs that they were uncertain about, occasionally made worse, sometimes fixed adequately, and almost never admitted they had needed help with. The plumber was a last resort. Calling the plumber before you had attempted the repair yourself was, socially speaking, a very specific kind of defeat. The basement workshop was the staging ground for much of this. A workbench with a pegboard behind it, tools hanging on hooks in the approximate shapes of the tools themselves, so that the absence of anyone was immediately visible, like a gap in a sentence. You had inherited some of these tools from your father and purchased others over the years, accumulating them with the same careful attention you applied to the car, a drill, a set of chisels, a handsaw, a level, a collection of wrenches organised in a way that made immediate sense to you and to no one else in the household. The basement was your domain. You went there when something needed doing, or occasionally when you needed somewhere to be alone for 20 minutes, which was not something you said out loud, but which the workshop permitted with no questions asked. The approach to a household repair in the 1950s followed a general progression. First, the assessment. You examined the problem with the focused expression of someone who absolutely knew what they were looking at. Then, the deliberation, a period of time that was technically thinking, but also contained a meaningful component of hoping the problem would resolve itself if you stared at it long enough. Then the attempt, which could go any number of directions depending on the nature of the repair, the quality of your tools, the age of the fixture in question, and the general disposition of your luck on that particular afternoon. Then, occasionally, the quiet worsening of the problem, which you did not announce but which became apparent over the following days, as the drip became a stream or the creak became a crack. Here is what nobody discussed. The entire do-it-yourself culture of the 1950s was premised on knowledge that had not necessarily been transmitted. Your grandfather may have built a barn. Your father may have rewired a circuit in a house that was somewhat more forgiving of improvised electrical work than the post-war construction you were now inhabiting. You had observed, You had absorbed what you could. But observation is not instruction, and many of the repairs that 1950s men undertook were exercises in confident improvisation rather than applied expertise, and the confidence was itself a required part of the presentation. Calling a professional was expensive, yes, but the financial objection was often secondary to the symbolic one. To call a plumber was to admit that the plumbing had defeated you, and things were not supposed to defeat you. You were supposed to be the person who handled things, and the things were supposed to be handleable, and the gap between those two positions, between what the culture expected of you and what was actually within your skill set, was navigated mostly through stubbornness and a willingness to spend 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon doing something that a professional could have completed in 40 minutes. The faucet got fixed, eventually. It was a victory. You mentioned it to no one, because competence was the baseline, not the achievement. The 1950s suburb placed men in a peculiar social position, close enough to their neighbours to be observed at all times, and far enough from their childhood communities that there was no shared history to fall back on. The neighbour was not a friend exactly, though he might become one, but a reference point, a standard, a quietly competitive presence who mowed his lawn, washed his car and kept his gutters clean with approximately the same frequency as you, which meant you were both watching each other for signs that someone was falling behind. The neighbourly wave, the over-the-fence conversation about nothing, the borrowed tool that was returned immediately and in perfect condition, all of it was social maintenance, performed with the care of someone who understood that reputation in a suburb was nearly impossible to recover once lost. The neighbour relationship had a specific grammar. You were friendly but not intimate. You exchanged information about weather, about the neighbourhood, about the practical matters of adjacent living, whose tree was losing branches toward whose roof, whose children had been playing in whose yard, the shared intelligence about the best route around the highway construction that had been going on since March. You helped each other with things that could be helped with. Jumper cables, borrowed ladders, a hand with moving something heavy. These exchanges were the currency of suburban sociability, and they were conducted with a warmth that was genuine within the specific boundaries of what was permitted. What was not permitted generally was anything that crossed into the personal. You did not tell your neighbour that you were struggling with your marriage, or that the job had become something you dreaded in a way you couldn't fully account for, or that you sometimes lay awake at night with a formless anxiety that had no object and no resolution. That was interior. The neighbour existed in the exterior world, the world of visible surfaces and practical exchanges, and the interior was not something you brought to the fence. This was not dishonesty exactly. It was more like a mutual agreement about where the conversation lived, and both parties honoured it, because both parties needed it. The competition between neighbours was real, but entirely unspoken and almost entirely plausible deniable. A man who bought a new car was not showing off. He needed a new car. A man who put in a new driveway was not making a statement. The old one was crumbling. A man who added a room to his house, painted the exterior, installed a new front door. All of these were practical decisions, each one of which was observed by every neighbour on the block and filed in the running ledger that everyone maintained and nobody acknowledged maintaining. You kept up. You stayed current. You did not fall visibly behind, because falling behind was not just a financial condition, it was a social one, and in the 1950s suburb, social standing was one of the things you were actively building with the mortgage and the lawn and the freshly washed car in the driveway every Sunday. The neighbour who fell behind was a cautionary tale that nobody narrated out loud. His lawn went unmowed for a week, then 2. His car stayed dirty. The paint on his trim began to peel and was not addressed. The neighbourhood noticed this accumulation of small neglects the way a doctor notices symptoms, with a growing picture that assembled itself into a diagnosis nobody spoke. Eventually someone would see his wife at the grocery store and form an impression, and the impression would travel, and by the time it completed its circuit it had become what the neighbourhood knew, which was not necessarily what was true, but was the version that stuck. The 1950s suburb was small, and small meant everything was everyone's information, whether anyone intended it to be or not. The 1950s business suit was not clothing in the casual sense, it was infrastructure. It held a man together in the morning when he might otherwise feel unformed, gave him a shape that the culture recognized as serious and established before he opened his mouth, that he was participating in the appropriate way. Men who dressed well were assumed to be competent. Men who did not were assumed to have given something up. The ritual of dressing, the pressed shirt, the tie knotted correctly, the jacket that fit because you'd worn it enough times to know, was also a ritual of self-assembly, of becoming the version of yourself that the day required. And when the jacket came off at the end of the evening, it wasn't clear, for some men, what was left. The suit was not cheap. A good one represented a significant investment for a middle-class man in the 1950s, which meant you had 2, possibly 3, and you rotated them with the careful attention of someone managing a limited resource. The navy suit for important meetings, the grey for ordinary Tuesdays, the brown, perhaps, for the office on Fridays when the atmosphere was slightly less formal. You knew each suit's condition, which lapel was beginning to show wear, which shoulder seam needed the tailor's attention, and you managed their deterioration with the same watchful practicality you applied to the car or the house. Things wore out. You maintained them as long as possible and replaced them when you absolutely had to. And the replacing was a considered event, not an impulse. The tie was the one place in the 1950s business wardrobe where something approaching personal expression was technically permitted. The range was narrow. You were not going to wear something that anyone would describe as bold without a tone that made clear it was not a compliment. But within that range there was a small, genuine choice. A stripe versus a solid. A particular shade of burgundy versus navy. Men who paid attention to their ties were understood to be men who paid attention generally, which was a compliment delivered in the specific language of a culture that expressed character through presentation rather than conversation. The morning ritual of dressing had a meditative quality that nobody would have called meditative at the time because the word had not yet arrived in the vocabulary of the suburban American man. But the sequence, shower, shave, shirt, tie, jacket, one final check in the mirror, was a process of assembly that contained its own internal logic and its own small satisfactions. The tie was straight, the collar lay flat, the jacket sat on the shoulders correctly, which it did because you had worn it enough times that it had learned the shape of you, which is the quiet promise that a well-made suit eventually delivers to the man who keeps it long enough. What the suit provided, beyond warmth and coverage, was a kind of external skeleton. On days when the interior felt uncertain, when the anxiety was present and the confidence was theoretical, the suit said, regardless of what is happening in here, what they see out there is a man who has his act together. The suit was a promise made to the world that the man inside was going to do his job, meet the standard, hold the shape. And most days the promise was kept, not because the man was certain of himself, but because the suit was, and the suit was all anyone else could see. Drinking in the 1950s was less a recreational choice than a structural element of social life. The after-work drink, the cocktail before dinner, the beer with the neighbour on the back porch, these were not indulgences. They were scheduled. They were normal. They were, in a certain sense, required. A man who didn't drink was viewed with mild curiosity, the way a man who didn't own a television might be viewed. Not quite wrong, but slightly outside the expected pattern. The cocktail party was a fixture of suburban social life, and a man was expected to be comfortable in it, to mix a drink competently, to hold a glass with ease, to laugh at the right moments and not talk about anything too serious. Drinking was one of the few places where a man was allowed to be slightly less composed, and so it was used heavily. The home bar, or the well-stocked liquor cabinet, was a point of quiet pride for many 1950s households. You kept scotch, you kept bourbon, you kept gin for the martinis that a certain type of social occasion required. You knew how to make a few drinks competently, the old-fashioned, the Manhattan, the martini in its correct proportions, which was a subject of genuine debate conducted in the serious register that men reserve for things that mattered to them. Whether the martini was 2 parts or 5 parts gin to vermouth, whether it should be shaken or stirred, whether the olive or the lemon twist. These were positions that men held and defended with a specificity that might have struck an outside observer as disproportionate to the object under discussion, and that outside observer would have been missing the point entirely. The after-work drink had a particular function. You came home from the office carrying the residue of the day, the meetings, the commute, the 1,000 small negotiations of professional life, and the drink was the mechanism by which you set it down. Or not exactly set it down, but softened its edges enough that you could sit at the dinner table and be present without the day leaking into everything. It was a transition ritual, a small ceremony of decompression, and it was available, and it worked well enough. And nobody asked too many questions about whether something more intentional might have served the same purpose with fewer long-term consequences. The cocktail party was theatre. Both the men and the women of the 1950s suburb understood this implicitly, and the performance was rehearsed across dozens of identical gatherings in nearly identical living rooms where the ice buckets sat on the sideboard, and someone had put out a cheese and crackers arrangement that nobody particularly wanted, but that was understood to be part of the staging. You circulated, you held your drink, you talked about things that were adjacent to real things without crossing into real things, because real things were not what cocktail parties were for. They were for confirming, collectively, that everything was fine, that the neighbourhood was functioning, that the arrangement everyone was participating in was going smoothly, and the drinks made this confirmation easier, and the laughter more available, and the evenings shorter than they would otherwise have been. There were men for whom the after-dinner drink became several after-dinner drinks, and this was noticed but not addressed directly, because addressing things directly was not in the 1950s social vocabulary. The neighbour who drank too much was a man who was going through something, and going through something was understood, and giving a man room while he went through something was a kind of courtesy. What nobody said was, he has nowhere to put what he is carrying, and this is where it is going. The era had not yet developed the language for that conversation, and so the conversation did not happen, and the drinks continued, and the evening ended, and tomorrow was another Monday. A significant number of men who were living the 1950s American dream had, not long before, been in a war. World War II ended in 1945. Korea was still raw. The men building the suburbs, buying the cars, mowing the lawns had, in many cases, recently witnessed things that had no adequate language in the culture they had returned to. And the culture, for its part, did not provide any. You came home, you got a job, you got a house, and you moved forward. Looking back was not encouraged. Therapy was for people who couldn't handle things. The expectation of stoicism that defined 1950s masculinity was particularly complicated for veterans who were quietly carrying weight that had no designated place to be put down. Many of them never mentioned the war to their children at all. The return from war was managed by a culture that was simultaneously grateful and impatient. The gratitude was genuine. Parades, handshakes, the GI Bill as a national acknowledgement that something significant had been asked and given. The impatience was also genuine, and it was the impatience of a country that needed to get on with it, that had been through enough, that was ready for normalcy and prosperity and the forward-looking energy of a nation that had won something important. The men who came home were expected to want the same thing, to be ready for the house and the job and the lawn, to slot back into civilian life with the efficiency of a returned traveller unpacking his bags. What the culture did not have room for was the man who was not quite ready, the one for whom the noise of the suburb, the children, the neighbours, the lawnmower on a Saturday morning, periodically intersected with sounds from somewhere else, something that had been filed but not resolved, stored in the body in ways that the body sometimes retrieved without permission. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a phrase in 1952. Shell shock was the older term, and it carried enough stigma that no man wanted it applied to him. What was available was the concept of the man who couldn't handle it, and no one wanted to be that man, so almost no one admitted to being it. The silence around the war had a specific quality in 1950s households. Children knew their fathers had served. They had the photographs, the occasional uniform piece kept in a closet, the discharge papers in a file somewhere. They might know the theatre, Pacific, Europe, Korea, but the contents of the experience were not transmitted. A child who asked a direct question about combat would often receive a brief factual answer that contained nothing interior, followed by a shift to something else, not with hostility exactly, with a kind of practiced smoothness that communicated, "This is where this conversation ends," and the child learned the boundary and respected it because the alternative was not available. What those men carried and did not discuss shaped the families around them in ways that were real and mostly unexamined for decades. The emotional unavailability, the quick anger, the hypervigilance that expressed itself as strictness, the distance that was sometimes read as coldness, all of it was connected in many cases to experiences that had no language and no outlet in the culture that surrounded them. They had been through something enormous and had been sent directly from that enormous thing into a suburb with a mortgage and a lawn, and the gap between those two things was vast, and they crossed it largely alone, and they managed it largely in silence, and from the outside it looked like strength, because that was the only available interpretation. The television arrived in the 1950s home with the energy of a minor deity. Suddenly there was something in the living room that everyone looked at, that structured the evening, that told the family what normal looked like. And what it mostly looked like, at least on the screen, was a man who was cheerful, capable, vaguely bumbling in an endearing way, and ultimately right about everything by the end of the half hour. The men of 1950s television were not complicated. They had jobs they didn't complain about, families they adored, and problems that resolved themselves before the second commercial break. Real men watched them and took notes, not always consciously, about the gap between what they saw on screen and what was actually happening in their houses, and that gap was, in many cases, significant. The television set was itself a status object in the early part of the decade, a signal that a household was current, was participating, was not behind. The first sets were expensive, small-screened, and technically temperamental, requiring an antenna adjustment that every man in a suburb performed at some point, while someone in the living room shouted warmer or colder from the couch. By the mid-50s, the television was nearly universal in American homes, and the evening had reorganized itself around its schedule. Dinner was timed, children's bedtimes were negotiated in relation to specific programs. The week had landmarks, which show aired on which night, which man came home on which evening knowing that a program he actually wanted to watch was on, which was one of the few purely recreational pleasures available to him in the domestic landscape. What the television did, beyond entertainment, was provide a continuous model of American family life that was aspirational, impossible, and entirely persuasive to a culture that was in the process of deciding what it was. Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. These programs were not documentaries, they were instructions, delivered in the gentle, well-lit language of comedy and warmth, about what the household should look and feel like. The father on television was patient, wise, mild-humoured, and almost never wrong in any way that mattered. He went to work in a suit, came home to a wife who had prepared something hot, and navigated the small crises of family life with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment his entire life. The real men watching him from the armchair had not prepared. They had arrived at fatherhood and husbandhood and home ownership through a series of steps that had each seemed like the only available next step. And now they were here, and the man on the screen handled it all with such serene competence that the watching was either comforting or vaguely demoralizing depending on what kind of day you were having, often both, in alternating waves, during the same half hour. The commercials were their own instruction set. They told you what to buy in order to be the man on the screen. The right car, the right appliances, the right cigarettes smoked in the right social setting, with the right expression of relaxed authority. Advertising in the 1950s was not subtle. It was aimed directly at the aspiration, at the version of yourself you were working toward, and it had correctly identified that the aspiration was available, and the anxiety around it was real, and the gap between the two was a space that products could occupy with remarkable efficiency. You watched, you absorbed, and the television hummed in the corner of the living room telling you what you were supposed to be, while you sat in the dark and wondered quietly whether you were getting there. Religious attendance in the 1950s was less about spiritual conviction for many men than about community standing. You went to church because your neighbours went to church, because your wife expected you to go to church, because a man who did not attend services was a man whose character was, in a vague and unspecified way, in question. The church in post-war suburban America was a social institution as much as a spiritual one, a place where you wore your good suit and shook the same hands as last week and confirmed, through your presence alone, that you were the kind of family that showed up. What you thought about during the sermon was your own business. What mattered was that you were there, visible, seated in the correct row and not fidgeting noticeably. Church membership in the 1950s was at historically high levels in America. Over 90% of the population claimed religious affiliation at the peak of the decade, a number that reflected the cultural weight of attendance rather than necessarily its spiritual intensity. The post-war suburbs were built alongside new churches, often in deliberate proximity, because the church was understood to be infrastructure as much as the school or the post office. It anchored the community, provided the social framework, supplied the occasions that required the good suit and the firm handshake and the standing in the parking lot afterward, talking about nothing in particular for 25 minutes before everyone went home to their Sunday meals. You sat through the sermon with the practiced patience of a man who had developed an internal life that could run parallel to an external event without either one noticeably interfering with the other. Some sermons connected. Some were the religious equivalent of a long meeting that could have been a memo. You adjusted your posture, you held the hymnal at the correct angle, and you produced the appropriate responses at the appropriate moments with the smooth automaticity of a man who had been doing this long enough that the muscle memory was complete. The social function of church was not cynical exactly. The connections formed there were real. The neighbours you saw every Sunday were also the ones who brought food when someone was sick, who helped in genuine emergencies, who constituted the network of practical support that the suburb depended on. The church organised the community in ways that were genuinely useful, and the men who served on its committees and boards were exercising a kind of civic responsibility that mattered even when the motivation was partly social rather than purely spiritual. Meaning and function were not always separable, and the 1950s man was not always interested in separating them. What the church also provided was a frame for the week, a beginning and an end, a moment of imposed reflection in the middle of a life that did not offer many such moments voluntarily. Whether the reflection connected to anything transcendent varied by the man and by the Sunday, but the structure of it, the standing, the sitting, the familiar words, the organ, the handshakes at the door was its own kind of anchor. In a decade that was moving very fast in directions that were not always clearly mapped, the church was something that held still. And for men who were performing competence and stability in every other room of their lives, a room where the performance was at least familiar and the expectations were stable was not nothing. It was, in its own understated way, a place to breathe. The 1950s American man was expected to be physically capable in a general, non-specific, always available way. He should be able to lift the heavy thing, carry the large box, move the furniture, fix the roof, chop the wood if wood needed chopping, and generally be the person his household called upon when something needed physical effort applied to it. This was not about athleticism or gym culture. Those were not yet the dominant languages of masculine identity they would later become. This was about utility, about being the body in the house that handled what needed handling. Men who were not physically strong were not often open about it. The appearance of capability was sufficient as long as you never encountered a situation that tested it directly. The physical standard was not articulated as a standard. It was simply present, ambient, assumed. Nobody told you that you were supposed to be able to carry a washing machine up a flight of stairs with one neighbour's assistance and no complaint. It was just what happened when the washing machine arrived and the delivery men left it at the bottom of the stairs, and everyone looked at you. You carried it. Your back registered an opinion about this that you did not share with anyone present. This was called being a man, and it was repeated across thousands of similar moments. The refrigerator, the sectional sofa, the bags of cement for the patio you were building because building a patio yourself was slightly less expensive than hiring someone and considerably more important to your self-concept. Physical labour in the 1950s carried a moral weight that it is difficult to fully convey to a generation that has outsourced most of its heavy lifting. A man who worked with his hands, who could see the physical evidence of what he had accomplished, the deck built, the fence repaired, the driveway repaved, had a relationship with his own capability that was direct and unambiguous in a way that the office job never quite provided. You did the thing. The thing was done. You could look at it. This was satisfying in a deep and somewhat wordless way that 1950s men understood without being able to explain, which was fine because explaining it was not in the available vocabulary. The body also had to be maintained in ways that were not discussed as maintenance. You ate what was put in front of you, which in the 1950s was often considerable and frequently beige. You did not diet. Dieting was something women did, monitored anxiously in women's magazines, discussed at the kitchen table with other women. A man who was watching his weight was a man engaged in an activity that the culture had not assigned to him, and the cognitive dissonance was sufficient that most men simply did not engage in it, even when the results of years of desk work and large meals were becoming visible in ways that the mirror made difficult to ignore. The Saturday morning physical labour was, among other things, a way of maintaining the fiction of physical capability. Mowing the lawn, digging the garden bed, carrying bags of mulch from the car to the backyard. None of it was exercise in any deliberate sense, but it was physical, and it was evidence, visible to yourself and anyone watching, that the body still worked, still did what was asked of it, still belonged to a man who had not yet been fully claimed by the chair and the desk and the commute, and the slow accumulation of a sedentary life. Your body would eventually have something to say about all of this, and it would say it in the doctor's office, which you had been avoiding, which brings us to another segment entirely. For now, you carried the thing. Your back ached quietly. You did not mention it. Progress. The relationship between the 1950s American man and his boss was one of the more psychologically interesting dynamics of the era, largely because it could not be discussed as a relationship. You did not talk about your feelings about your boss. You did not analyse the dynamic. You either performed well enough to be noticed favourably, or you did not, and if you did not, you adjusted your performance rather than your understanding of the situation. A good boss was one who was fair and did not yell often. A difficult boss was simply part of the job, the way that weather was part of farming. You adapted. The idea of addressing workplace behaviour directly, asking for feedback, expressing a concern, having a conversation about your professional development was largely outside the available script for most men in the 1950s office. The boss occupied a position in the 1950s man's life that was structurally similar to other authoritative relationships he had navigated. The father, the commanding officer, the coach, in that approval was something you earned through performance rather than requested through conversation. You demonstrated competence and you waited. The waiting was the hard part, because it offered no information and required you to interpret silence as either neutral or positive and act accordingly. A boss who said nothing about your work was either satisfied or had not noticed, and distinguishing between the two required a kind of organisational reading that you developed over time and were never entirely confident about. The annual review was the one official moment when the relationship between your performance and your standing was supposed to be made explicit. and it was, in many offices, a remarkably uncomfortable 20 minutes in which a man who was not a trained communicator attempted to convey a numerical assessment of another man's value using a form that had been designed by someone in human resources who had also not been a trained communicator. You sat across the desk, you received the number, you said thank you. If the number was good, you felt briefly validated. If it was not, you sat with that privately and adjusted your behaviour in ways that you hoped would address whatever had produced the insufficient number, even though you were not entirely sure what that was because the feedback had been delivered in the specific language of corporate indirectness that meant something without saying it. The boss was often not a particularly extraordinary person. He had navigated the same system you were navigating, had arrived slightly earlier, had accumulated the seniority that translated into the private office and the corner parking space, and was now responsible for managing people who were essentially in the position he had been in 10 years prior. Some bosses remembered this and were decent about it. Others had travelled far enough from their own uncertainty that they had forgotten what it felt like, and those were the ones who made the Tuesday afternoons long in the specific way that has no name but every employee in every era has experienced. You did not complain about your boss to your wife in any detailed way, because complaining was a form of weakness and because the alternative, finding another job, was a significant disruption that the mortgage and the family schedule and the general stability of your life did not easily accommodate. You managed, you adapted, you found the specific combination of competence and deference that the boss in question responded to, and you delivered it reliably, and you went home and said fine when asked how work was, because that was the available answer, and also, most days, approximately accurate. In the 1950s, building something with your hands was one of the few areas of life where a man could be openly, visibly proud of himself without anyone thinking it was unseemly. The workshop in the basement or the garage became a private kingdom for men who had very few private kingdoms. You built a bookshelf. You built a deck. You built a birdhouse that nobody needed but that represented, in its careful joinery and sanded edges, something about order and competence and making a thing that lasted. Workshop projects required no emotional vocabulary. They required patience, skill, and the satisfying logic of a problem that could be solved with the right tool. For a generation of men who were not encouraged to articulate much of anything, the workshop was a place where the hands did the speaking. The appeal of making something was not complicated, but it was deep. Every other arena of the 1950s man's life involved managing relationships, navigating hierarchies, maintaining performances, and producing outcomes that were evaluated by other people using criteria that were not fully transparent. The workshop had none of this. Wood was wood. A joint either fit or it didn't. A surface was either smooth or it required more sanding, and the sanding was available and the outcome was knowable, and the entire transaction was between you and the material and the tool and nothing else. This was not a small thing in a life that contained a great deal of ambiguity. Men in this era built things with the seriousness of people who understood that what they were making was partly the object and partly themselves. The bookshelf was a bookshelf. It was also evidence to yourself primarily, though the family would see it, that you could conceive of a thing, gather the materials, apply the skill, and produce a result that would stand in the house long after you were done with it. Permanence mattered. The 1950s man lived in a culture of manufactured goods, of planned obsolescence beginning to appear on the horizon, of things that were bought and used and replaced. Something he had made himself operated in a different category. It was his in a way that nothing purchased could be. The children observed all of this, usually from a respectful distance that had been established early in the workshop's history. You might be allowed to hold something, to pass a tool, to watch the process. But the workshop was adult territory, and the boundary was clear, and the children respected it partly because of its clarity, and partly because something about the concentrated focus of a man at his workbench suggested that this was not a space for casual interruption. Boys sometimes internalise the workshop as their first understanding of what it looked like when a man was genuinely absorbed in something, not performing, not maintaining, just doing. The finished object went into the house with a quietness that was its own kind of announcement. The bookshelf appeared in the living room, the deck appeared behind the house. Nobody made a speech about it. Your wife said something warm and true, and you said it was nothing, which was not accurate but was the correct response in a culture that did not have a comfortable script for accepting a compliment about something you had made yourself. It was not nothing. It was the thing you had made with your hands in the hours that belonged to you, in the space that was yours, using skills that were yours in a way that the job and the house and the lawn were not quite yours. The birdhouse sat in the yard. Nobody lived in it for 2 seasons. You were not disappointed. You had built it anyway. The 1950s family vacation was a remarkable exercise in cheerful obligation. You packed the station wagon, which required a specific spatial intelligence that every father in America believed he uniquely possessed, drove somewhere that had been agreed upon through a negotiation nobody acknowledged was a negotiation, and spent approximately 2 weeks being visibly present with your family in a location that was not your house. The vacation was supposed to be rest, which made the amount of effort it required somewhat difficult to explain. Hotels, itineraries, children who were unhappy in the car, meals at restaurants you didn't choose, all of it fell to the man to manage with the serene competence of someone who had definitely done this before. The packing of the station wagon was a ritual that deserves its own extended meditation. The station wagon was the family vehicle of the era, large, practical, capable of absorbing an improbable quantity of luggage if approached with sufficient architectural ambition. You began with the large cases, placed flat at the back, and worked forward in layers of diminishing size, fitting bags and boxes and the children's inexplicable auxiliary items, the pillow that had to come, the toy that couldn't be left, the thing that seemed unnecessary but whose absence would cause a disruption that was not worth the saved space, into the remaining geometry of the cargo area. You closed the tailgate with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a spatial puzzle, and then someone remembered something, and you opened it again. The drive itself was both the vacation and the test of whether the vacation was working. Hours in a confined space with children who experienced the passage of time differently than adults, more slowly, more loudly, with a more frequent need for bathrooms than seemed physically plausible, required a patience that was real and a cheerfulness that was performed, and both were depleted at roughly the same rate over the course of the first day. You drove. The radio offered limited options. The landscape changed or didn't depending on the route. Someone in the back seat asked how long until you got there, and you answered, and 20 minutes later someone asked again, and you answered again, with only a minor variation in tone that you hoped was not noticeable. The destination was a motel, or a relative's house, or a cabin if you were the kind of family that did cabins, which carried its own set of maintenance implications because a cabin did not maintain itself, and the man who arrived at a cabin was also the man who would be assessing the cabin's condition within approximately 4 minutes of arrival. The beach, if you went to the beach, involved sand that found its way into things, sunburn that arrived despite precautions, and an ocean that the children found enormously exciting in ways that required continuous supervision. The mountains involved altitude and weather, and the particular exhaustion of hiking with people who had not trained for hiking, but had agreed to it at a planning meeting 6 weeks prior when it sounded appealing. At the end of the vacation, you drove home with the knowledge that the lawn had been doing its own thing for 2 weeks and would require attention before you had fully recovered from the trip. The mail had accumulated. The office would be exactly as you left it, which was to say, waiting. You pulled into the driveway, unloaded the station wagon with the same spatial precision in reverse, and went inside. The vacation had happened. You had been present for it. Everyone had been mostly fine. This was called success, and you called it that, and you meant it, and you were already thinking about next year. Male friendship in the 1950s was an institution built almost entirely on presence rather than conversation. Men were friends with other men in the sense that they spent time together, watched the game together, worked on cars together, stood on adjacent lawns drinking something cold and remarking on the heat. Talking about how you were actually doing was not, generally speaking, a feature. This was not hostility or indifference. It was, in its way, a kind of loyalty, a shared understanding that you were both out here, navigating the same impossible expectations, and that the simple fact of standing next to each other counted for something. What went unspoken between friends in the 1950s could fill several warehouses, and most of it stayed there. The male friendship of this era was conducted almost entirely through activity. You did not meet for the purpose of talking. You met for the purpose of doing something, and the conversation happened in the margins of the doing, and the margins were where the actual friendship lived. Watching a game together was a legitimate social event because the game provided structure, something to look at, something to react to, a shared external object that made the presence of another person natural and the silence between exchanges unremarkable. Without the game, two men sitting together in silence would have been a situation that required explanation. With it, the silence was just watching. The topics that were available in 1950s male friendship formed a specific and somewhat narrow catalogue. Sports were primary, scores, statistics, predictions about upcoming games, the particular pleasure of being right about something athletic weeks before it happened. Work was available in general terms: the commute, the incompetent colleague, the Friday that had been longer than it needed to be, but not in the specific emotional register that would have constituted genuine disclosure. Cars were always available. The lawn, in season, was available. Local news, the road construction, the new business, the thing that had happened to someone tangentially connected to both of you was available. Your actual interior experience of your life was not available, and this was understood without anyone establishing the rule. What the friendship provided within these constraints was real. The company of another man who was carrying approximately what you were carrying, without either of you having to acknowledge the weight, was a form of comfort that the era understood and relied upon. You were not alone in the sense of being physically isolated. You were among others who were doing the same thing, and the doing of the same thing in proximity was solidarity, even when it looked like two men standing next to a car talking about the carburetor. Some friendships ran deeper than others, and the depth was expressed not through more conversation, but through a different quality of silence, the kind that developed between men who had spent enough time together that the silences were comfortable rather than awkward, that the unspoken was familiar rather than avoided. These were the friendships that lasted decades, that were described, when described at all, in purely factual terms. We've known each other since the army, since the neighbourhood, since that job in 51. The feeling behind the fact was not narrated, because narrating it would have changed its nature, and both men knew this, and both men let the fact stand where the feeling could have been, and found it sufficient. Segment 26. The pressure to be happy when contentment became mandatory. One of the stranger aspects of 1950s American culture was its insistence on happiness. Not just the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution had always allowed for that, but the performance of it, loudly and continuously. Magazine covers, television programs, advertisements, and neighbourhood social life all converged on the same message. This is the best time to be alive in the greatest country in the world, and if you're not beaming, something is wrong with you specifically. For a man who was quietly struggling, with money, or his marriage, or the job, or something he couldn't quite name, this ambient expectation of contentment was its own particular burden. You weren't just failing to be happy, you were failing to be the kind of American man who was supposed to be happy. The post-war prosperity narrative was genuinely powerful and genuinely earned in many respects. The Depression had been catastrophic. The war had been devastating. What came after, the jobs, the houses, the appliances, the suburban expansion, was by any measurable standard an improvement over what had preceded it. And the men who had lived through the preceding decades understood this in their bodies in a way that the generation being raised in the suburbs would not quite replicate. You had come from something harder. This was better. The gratitude was real. But gratitude and happiness are not the same thing, and the cultural conflation of the two in the 1950s created a specific kind of trap. You were grateful for the house, for the job, for the family, for the country, and you were also sometimes deeply uncertain whether any of it was what you actually wanted. Not in a dramatic, repudiating way, but in the quiet, nagging way of a person who made a series of reasonable decisions and arrived somewhere that was perfectly adequate and somehow not quite right. And that uncertainty had no approved outlet in a culture that required you to be not just surviving, but thriving, not just managing, but beaming. The pressure to perform happiness was particularly acute in social settings. The neighbourhood gathering, the office party, the church social, all of them required a version of you that was upbeat, engaged, and visibly enjoying the life you were living. A man who seemed flat, or distracted, or who let some ambient sadness register on his face at the wrong moment, was a man who made other people uncomfortable, because his unhappiness was a challenge to the collective narrative that everyone was invested in maintaining. You kept the face, you made the joke, you poured another drink and confirmed, through your performance, that the project was going well. What nobody said, but what was true, was that the mandatory happiness of the 1950s was exhausting. In the specific way that any sustained performance is exhausting, it required continuous effort, continuous monitoring, continuous adjustment. You woke up and checked the weather of your own interior and then set it aside and produced the face that the day required. Some days this was easy, and some days it was the hardest thing you did, and the hardest days were indistinguishable from the easy ones, which was the point, and also the cost. The 1950s, American man had a complicated relationship with his own health, which is to say he mostly ignored it. Doctors were for emergencies. Going to the doctor for something that wasn't actively killing you was, at best, an overreaction, and at worst a sign of weakness that would get around. Chest pain. Probably nothing. Persistent cough. Work through it. Crushing fatigue that had been building since 1949. Have a drink and get to bed at a reasonable hour. The idea of preventive care, of proactively monitoring and maintaining one's own health, was not yet a feature of the cultural landscape for men in this era. You were fine until you weren't, and when you weren't, you went to the hospital, and if you were lucky, you came home. The logic of medical stoicism was internally consistent in a way that made it very difficult to argue with from inside the 1950s worldview. You were a man. Men were supposed to be durable. Durability meant not requiring maintenance. Requiring maintenance meant something had gone wrong with the durability, which was itself a kind of failure. Going to the doctor before something was visibly, urgently wrong was an admission that you were monitoring yourself for weakness, which implied that weakness was a possibility you were taking seriously, which implied that you were perhaps not as solid as the presentation required. It was a tightly circular logic, and it killed men at statistically significant rates that nobody was quite connecting to the logic at the time. Your wife likely wanted you to go to the doctor more often than you did. This was understood and managed through a specific kind of marital negotiation, in which she expressed concern in terms that were careful enough not to imply that you were incapable of assessing your own condition, and you heard the concern and filed it underhandled, and nothing changed, and the conversation recurred at intervals that corresponded to whatever symptom you were currently not mentioning. She knew about the symptom. You knew she knew. This was not discussed. The doctor's office, when you finally went, was its own performance. You minimised. You described a symptom that had been present for 6 weeks as something that had started recently. You used the language of slight discomfort for things that had been waking you up. The doctor, who had seen many men of your exact description with your exact approach to medical disclosure, often had to work around the minimisation to get to the actual picture, and the actual picture was sometimes considerably more concerning than the version you'd presented. This was, from a public health standpoint, not ideal. The men who died of heart attacks in their 50s in the 1950s did not, as a rule, die of surprise. They died of a long accumulation of symptoms that had been noted internally, attributed to stress or aging, or the general wear of a busy life, and not acted upon because acting upon them would have required a kind of self-prioritization that the era had not authorized for men. You took care of everyone else first. Your body was the last item on the list. By the time it moved to the top, it had been waiting long enough that the conversation had become urgent in ways that could not be walked back, and the man who had spent 30 years looking after everything else finally found himself in a hospital bed looking at the ceiling and discovering that he had been, apparently, more important to the whole arrangement than he had been willing to admit while he could still do something about it. Despite the gleaming mythology of post-war American prosperity, the new houses, the new cars, the televisions and washing machines and refrigerators all arriving at once, many 1950s men were operating on financial margins that were narrower than they appeared. The mortgage was real. The car payment was real. The expectation that you would absorb all of it without visible strain was also real, and the gap between the three was a source of quiet anxiety that moved through the era like an undercurrent nobody named. Financial stress was not something a man discussed with his wife in any detail, because the wife's security was part of what he was responsible for maintaining, and the appearance of control was itself a kind of product he was delivering. You didn't count the money out loud where anyone could hear you doing it. The post-war consumer economy was expanding in ways that were genuinely dazzling, and also specifically designed to convert that dazzlement into purchase. The appliances arrived. The automobile industry produced new models annually, each slightly longer and more chrome-laden than the last, each one implying that last year's model was already dated in ways that a serious man should address. The television manufacturers updated their sets. The furniture stores showed room arrangements that looked nothing like your current living room, and the gap between what the room looked like in the magazine and what it looked like in your house was a gap that spending could theoretically close, and the credit industry, newly expanded and newly aggressive, was prepared to help you close it. The result was that many men in the 1950s were financing a version of prosperity that was real in its visible dimensions and stretched in its underlying structure. The house was real. The lawn was real. The new car in the driveway was real. The number in the savings account was doing its best. You managed the flow of money with the careful attention of someone playing a game where the rules kept changing and the scoring was not entirely transparent, and you did it alone because managing money was a male domain, and the managing included absorbing the stress of the management so that the household did not have to feel it. Financial anxiety in the 1950s had no approved outlet that did not itself cost money. You could not go to therapy, which was expensive and stigmatized. You could not discuss it with friends because everyone was maintaining the same fiction. You could not discuss it with your wife in any detail that conveyed actual uncertainty, because actual uncertainty was not part of the provider presentation. You could drink, which was affordable and available. You could work more, which was free and socially celebrated. You could lie awake at 3 a.m. running numbers in your head while your wife slept beside you, which cost nothing but the sleep. And the sleep was something you were already not getting enough of, and the fatigue compounded the anxiety, and the anxiety interrupted the sleep, and the mortgage was due in 11 days. The men who held it together financially, who made the payments and kept the cars running, and sent the children to college eventually, did so through a combination of discipline, luck, economic circumstance, and a chronic low-grade tension that they carried so continuously that they eventually stopped registering it as tension and simply accepted it as the texture of adult life. This was not sustainable as a long-term health strategy, but it was the available one, and they used it, and most of them made it to the other side, and the ones who asked them about it in later years got the same answer. It was fine. It worked out. Which was true, and also a significant understatement, and they would not be elaborating. Somewhere in the middle of the 1950s American man's life, usually around the time the children were old enough to need less, the mortgage was partially paid down, and the job had settled into its permanent shape. there arrived a question that the culture had made very little room for. Was this it? Not out of ingratitude or despair, but out of the simple human impulse to take stock, to look at the shape of the life that had assembled around you, and ask whether it was the right shape. This question had no clean answer, and more importantly, it had no approved venue. Men did not sit around and discuss their existential uncertainty over cocktails. They bought a boat, or a new car, or threw themselves into the lawn with renewed intensity, and the question went mostly unanswered until it stopped being asked. The question arrived, typically, somewhere in the early to mid-40s, which in the 1950s was not the young 40 that the phrase suggests today. By 43, a man of the post-war era had been working for approximately 20 years, had been married for roughly 15, had children who were becoming people independent of him, and had a body that was beginning to offer feedback about the previous 4 decades in ways that were increasingly difficult to attribute to a single bad night. The life was assembled. The question was whether the assembly had produced what he had imagined, back when the imagining was still available to him. The midlife restlessness of this era expressed itself in specific and culturally approved forms that served as outlets without requiring anyone to acknowledge what they were outlets for. The boat was the most iconic, a vessel purchased at a price that caused brief visible tension at home, justified as a practical recreational investment and understood by everyone as something else entirely. The boat required maintenance, which gave the man something to do on weekends that was absorbing and solitary and involved tools. It could be taken out on the water, where the distance from the shore was physical and also temporarily psychological. Men who bought boats were not running away from anything. They were simply acquiring a vehicle that went in a direction nothing else in their lives went, which was away. The affairs that occurred in this era, and they occurred at rates the decade was not inclined to examine carefully, were often expressions of the same question. Not primarily physical, not primarily romantic, but a desperate inquiry into whether there was a version of the life that felt different, that had not yet calcified into its permanent shape, that might still contain some element of the self that had been set aside at 25 in favour of the mortgage and the lawn and the commute. The inquiry rarely produced useful answers. It produced instead a second set of complications layered over the first, and the man who emerged from them was usually not clearer about his life, but was now managing additional information that also could not be discussed. What the era did not provide was any legitimate structure for the midlife question. No cultural permission to sit with it, to take it seriously, to say out loud, "I have been living this life for 20 years, and I am not certain it is the right one, and I would like to think about that with some help." The vocabulary was not available. The venues were not available. The man who was brave enough or desperate enough to try to ask the question anyway found himself in a conversation that nobody around him had the equipment for, and so the question went back into the vault with everything else, and the boat sat in the driveway and Monday came again. The men who built 1950s America did not, for the most part, leave behind detailed accounts of what it had been like. They left houses and cars and savings accounts and silence. They left children who grew up observing them from a distance, slightly awed, slightly baffled, occasionally afraid of them, who would spend decades in therapy and memoir and conversation trying to reconstruct what their fathers had actually been feeling during all those Saturday mornings and Sunday dinners and long, quiet car trips to places nobody had really chosen. The great irony of the 1950s man is that the standard he was measured against, provider, protector, stoic pillar, made it nearly impossible for the people who loved him most to actually know him. He showed up, he provided, he stayed, and the rest of him remained largely behind a door that nobody knew how to open, and that he had long since forgotten the key to himself. The children who grew up in those houses absorbed the template without being taught it directly. Boys learned to contain themselves by watching their fathers contain themselves, and the lesson arrived not through instruction, but through accumulation, through the thousands of small moments in which the father's response to difficulty was silence and competence rather than expression and vulnerability. girls learned something about what men were like, what to expect and what not to expect, what was available and what was not, and carried that understanding into their own adult relationships with consequences that played out across the following decades in ways that the 1950s household could not have anticipated and did not particularly try to. The relationship between the 1950s father and his adult children, when those children finally became adults capable of asking better questions, was often a delicate negotiation between what the child needed to understand and what the father was capable of providing. A son who wanted to know what his father had actually felt, what the job had really been like, whether he had ever doubted any of it. That son was asking for something that required a kind of retrospective vulnerability that many of these men could not access. Not because they were unwilling exactly, but because the mechanism for it had never been developed, and asking them to produce it late in life was like asking someone to speak a language they had never been taught. The goodwill was sometimes present. The capacity was not. What many of the children of the 1950s man eventually came to understand, often after the father was gone, when the understanding could no longer be used in conversation, was that the distance had not been indifference. The silence had not been absence of feeling. The man who sat at the head of the table and said very little and provided everything, and showed up to every school event and came home every night, and paid every bill on time had been full of something that he had never found a way to say, in a culture that had not wanted him to say it, at a time when saying it was not an available option for a man of his generation and his understanding of what a man was supposed to be. The legacy of the 1950s American man is built into the houses he maintained, the careers he sustained, the families he anchored, and the deep generational shift in masculine culture that his children and grandchildren spent the following decades undertaking, not in rejection of him, but as a continuation of something he had started in the only way available to him, which was to provide a stable enough foundation that the people who came after him had the security to ask questions he never could. He did not ask them. He made it possible for someone else to. That is, in its own quiet way, a form of love. And if he could not tell you that himself, it is because no one ever showed him how. And he gave you everything he had anyway, and the rest he carried alone until he didn't have to anymore. And so, here you are. You have made it through the whole day, through the pressed shirts and the polished shoes, through the fluorescent offices and the banked fires of the emotional vault, through the lawns that never quite cooperated and the cars that were loved more openly than the people inside the house. You have watched a man navigate a world that handed him a checklist instead of a conversation, a role instead of a permission slip, a standard instead of a question worth asking. And the remarkable thing, the thing worth sitting with as you settle into the particular darkness of wherever you are right now, is that most of them did it. They showed up. Every single day in the pressed shirt and the correct tie knot, with the firm handshake and the adequate answer and the lawn that was generally under control, they carried the mortgage and the silence and the question they were not allowed to ask, and they carried it for decades, and they did not put it down, and they kept going. That is not nothing. That is, in its own complicated and imperfect and deeply human way, extraordinary. Because the 1950s, American man was not a simple creature, despite everything the era did to simplify him. Behind the performance was a person, one who had often come from very hard things, who was trying to build something better for the people he loved, who was doing the best he could with the tools the culture had given him, which were, on the emotional side of the ledger, genuinely quite limited. He was not wrong to want the house and the stability and the family. He was not wrong to work for it. What was wrong, or at least incomplete, was a world that asked everything of him, and then offered nowhere to put the weight of it. So tonight, as you lie in whatever comfort you have assembled for yourself, your soft bed, your climate-controlled room, your access to conversations and vocabularies and relationships that would have been essentially unavailable to the man on the riding mower in 1957, maybe take a quiet moment for him, for the man who got up every morning and became the version of himself the day required, who fixed the gutters in October and drove the station wagon in July and sat at the head of the table and passed the bread and meant it. All of it, in the only way he knew how to mean anything, which was through showing up and staying. He was not perfect. The standard never was, but he was there, and he tried. And the world you live in was built in no small part on the foundation he laid down in silence and maintained without complaint. Sleep well. You have earned it. And so did he.